Welcome to the GS Podcast. I'm Stephen Knight. I hope you're all well. Very pleased to be bringing you another excellent conversation. I'll be speaking to writer, social commentator and director of the Free Speech Union, Inaya Folarin Iman. We're going to be talking about race relations and Black Lives Matter. So, nice mellow stuff. Nothing to worry about. I'm sure it'll be fine. Obviously, you would have all noticed the world has been gripped in response to the murder of George Floyd in the USA. And any decent, remotely, mentally competent individual should or will see his death for the inexcusable injustice that it was. And now we're gripped in a response of sorts. And I think it's really important how we consider the response. So I could spend an hour on the podcast telling you what you already know, namely that racism is very real and very wrong, and that racist narratives have dangerous real-world consequences. This is true. However, I think it's also clear, or at least it should be, that false narratives on racism can have dangerous consequences too. Although where even so much as an inkling or suspicion of racism gets a spanking in all areas of civil society, however, false narratives on racism do not get the same response. People propagating harmful notions on the issue of racism pay no cost whatsoever, and I see this incessantly from certain areas of the commentariat. Blue ticky journalist and activist saying the most divorced from reality things you could possibly imagine on the issue of race relations, either in the USA or the UK. And I don't see the utility in focusing my output on areas of mass agreement. I like to poke at blind spots on consequential issues. So that's why I make myself unpopular in certain circles by banging on about the dangers of Islamism or the harms of meat consumption. That one always loses me a significant amount of support. But I don't care, because I'm going to talk about the things I feel are important. And I think we can now add Black Lives Matter and their claims about police shootings into this category of false narratives that have consequential outcomes. Long-time listeners will have noticed that this podcast has always had a focus on platforming a quote-unquote alternative or minority voice, and this isn't some sort of misguided commitment to contrarianism. I do this because I think these voices actually represent a credible challenge to the popular false narratives. And the problem with false narratives on this issue is they get more people killed, which they now have. And another problem with false narratives is that they lead to bad solutions that do absolutely nothing to improve the material lives of black people in the UK or the US. So we see people tweeting a slogan or taking the knee or unleash the rage at a few statues, and the dial on equality doesn't shift an inch. So it all feels like theatre to me. And I think the skeptical movement has gone completely missing on the issue of racism in general, especially where it pertains to gun violence and the police. I think we've also gone completely missing on the claims of Black Lives Matter. And as a movement, that skeptics I'm talking about here, as a movement that prides itself on facts over feelings, it seems completely adverse to the facts on this topic. So we'll be digging into them in a bit more detail on the show. For those of you wanting to hear more on the USA context specifically, and gun violence and policing and the shooting of black suspects, armed or otherwise, I'd highly recommend Sam Harris's latest podcast. It's called Can We Pull Back from the Brink? Sam's probably at his most rational here with full recourse to the data and case studies. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. And regardless of how insanely articulate someone like Sam Harris is on this issue, and how much thought he gives to actual instances of inequality people will still smear him and claim to detect ulterior motives, which goes to show you how impossible it is to have useful conversations on this issue at the minute, and what you can expect to come your way if you actually try to have a detailed, nuanced conversation. And this is where Inaya comes in. She talks a lot of sense, and although she is black, it really shouldn't matter. A person of any ethnicity could have noticed the things she has, and really should have. I suppose if there's something useful to come from having a black person cutting through these false narratives, it's that the left gets to understand that black people are not an homogenous group where experiences and views are concerned. This idea that there is one authentic black viewpoint on Black Lives Matter or systemic racism is as patronising as it is racist, and I think we should start to call that out more often when we see it. So I really enjoyed hearing from Inaya. She talks a lot of sense, as I've said. I imagine you'll enjoy hearing from her too. Make sure you send her some love, send her some feedback, send her some follow-up questions on Twitter. You can find her at Inaya Folarin. My beautiful Patreon supporters would have had access to this conversation earlier than this general release as a small thank you. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can do by visiting gspellchecker.com/support. Enjoy. It's a great pleasure to welcome Inaya Folarin Iman to the podcast. Hello.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
It's my pleasure. How are you doing?
I'm really good. Crazy times.
Yes, I was just remarking to you before we started recording that I imagine you've been exceptionally busy these last few weeks.
Indeed, yeah, I have. I never, for a couple years now, I've been talking about free speech. Recently, I've been talking about the lockdown. I never thought that I would be kind of thrown in the deep end of all of these kind of race conversations. So it's new territory for me as well.
Dangerous territory.
Yeah.
I'm going to let you take point, I think. But I suppose before we delve into this dangerous territory and the response we've seen from the killing of George Floyd in America and how that's had a knock-on effect to our little island, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself first. How did you come to be politically engaged to the point where you are a media figure, you are an activist of sorts?
Yeah, I think it's kind of, a lot of it has been, I guess, maybe something that I've always been interested in, but a lot of what has kind of developed my position that I'm in today have just been often quite spontaneous, even like this particular situation with kind of the whole race conversation in Britain. But, growing up, I came from a single parent household. My mum worked 3 jobs to send my sister and I to fee-paying schools. And she, despite kind of having a lot of issues in terms of her life, she always kind of encouraged my sister and I to really get interested in the world around us, to never see any barriers as potential boundaries for us reaching our potential. And she always kind of inculcated that very go-getting and kind of socially aware and politically minded mentality. So I think that really, really shaped my interest going into my adulthood. And then I think I particularly became radicalized when I went to university. And as I already said, I was always been really interested in a whole range of political ideas and understanding the nuances and complexities about the world. And as much as I love university, I was really shocked and disappointed to see how stifling and limiting the climate of free speech and kind of challenging rigorous intellectual ideas were. And so I think that was a huge wake-up call, because I felt like a lot of people were speaking for me. Obviously, being a young Black woman, there was a particular narrow perception I felt of what it really meant to be a young Black woman in Britain. And I wanted to be part of challenging and broadening that perspective and kind of showing that there's not one way to be a woman, to be Black, to be any of those things, that ultimately we are individuals. And so that's really been why I've kind of championed the mentality and the kind of arguments I have, and try to engage in politics from essentially, a perspective that people don't conventionally see people like me arguing.
Right. And where would you place yourself on the political scale? I seem to remember seeing a video of yours where you actually announced that you've left the left wing of the political spectrum. So maybe you could explain a little bit about why you made that decision and where you place yourself now.
Yeah, so funnily enough, I did actually grow up somewhat conservative. My mum was conservative, as I described. She was very much like pull yourself up by your bootstraps and go get personal responsibility. But then, when I went to university, the kind of dominant ideas that I did hear were of the left, and these ideas that like Britain and the West are institutionally racist, sexist, and patriarchal. And as going into an environment which is meant to be the bastion for intellectual understanding, that's what I thought was, what I saw was being articulated and argued most strongly.
Where was this sort of anti-Britain mindset coming from? Was it the students, or was it the tutors, or a combination of both, in your view?
Yeah, I think it was a combination of both. I think a lot of the time, so for example, there's been this movement in a lot of universities called decolonize the curriculum.
Yeah.
And I think, and in my university, it was called Why is My Curriculum White? And so I think very real and perhaps legitimate concerns about the kind of narrative about what Britain is historically and means today are often hijacked by people that I do think are putting forward a very particular political agenda. And I think you find that particularly people on the left are, generally speaking, a lot more forthright when it comes to organising, campaigning, and so they often end up dominating many of the institutions that end up shaping university life. So it did come from a wide range of perspectives at university. And so I felt, yes, I think that really did influence me in terms of my political standpoint in the early times of my 20s. But then having spent time throughout my 20s living in other countries, I think that again was another huge wake-up call in terms of realizing how amazing and wonderful and beautiful our country is. As much as there are things that do need to change, I actually think that we've lost a lot of faith in the values and achievements that we have had in terms of democracy and freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. These are things that many people across the world are fighting for and dying for. And I really realize that I think that the meaning and value of those things are increasingly being lost.
People would often, there's this horrible dichotomy now where in mainstream talk, left wing is just used as a shorthand to mean good, right wing as a shorthand to mean bad. And I suppose some of the values you list there, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, sort of these liberal ideals, would be placed by most on the left-wing political spectrum. But you obviously you no longer identify as left-wing. Would you describe yourself as more of a centrist or right-wing? Where would you place yourself?
Yeah, as I said, I really think it is hard. I think, this cliche phrase, politically homeless, I think I have a lot of sympathies. I am conservative insofar as I do think that there are things about British society worth conserving and that are important and should not be just kind of radically changed in an instant. But I think I'm quite libertarian insofar as I do think that, we should be championing and kind of working to forward the cause of human liberty and freedom. So, I'm very skeptical of, surveillance legislation and kind of curbs to free speech. But I would say that I am left as well insofar as I do think that we have systems of inequality within our society that are perpetuating itself, and that a lot of people within our current kind of, I think, neoliberal order are being left behind. And I think an actual interventionist approach in some areas of, some might say, the kind of quote unquote left behind areas of Britain would actually be quite a helpful and positive thing. So I'd say politically I'm quite eclectic.
Right, yeah. It can obviously sometimes be seen as a toolbox approach, can't it? You can be conservative on some issues, more liberal on others. I suppose it depends on the issue. One of the main reasons I'm speaking to you today, and I've always kind of noted when you've popped up on sort of Sunday morning religious debate, or I always jot your name down. I think I really need to speak to this person because you're often there, in my view, representing sanity that day. But the main reason we're speaking today is because obviously we saw in the news the murder of George Floyd, a black man in Minneapolis, America, at the hands of the police. And that started a chain reaction across the globe, and obviously England as well. I think that, there's that cliched expression, is there, that when America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. And I thought maybe it might be a good point to start this conversation with talking a little bit about the differences in race relations in America versus the UK, or how you see any differences that are worth highlighting?
Yeah, so obviously the particular context that I would say that I have a lot more knowledge about, from not only just kind of factually but also my own experience, is obviously Britain. But I do think that there are some really important fundamental differences, and I think I've been disappointed in the way in which kind of the race relations, the kind of racial culture, particularly in America, has been exported globally in a way that's actually in some ways bulldozing over a lot of the quite fundamental and important differences. And so, for example, most of the Black people in Britain came here during the post-war years of immigration. Now, there are a strong and really important legacy of Black Britons going back hundreds and hundreds of years. But in terms of the overwhelming majority of Black Britons in this country, have actually been here since kind of post-1960s immigration. So I think that that's really different in terms of the kind of more historical, structural problems that came to shape America. So we talk about, slavery, obviously, Jim Crow laws, and the more kind of famous civil rights movement. There was a kind of smaller civil rights movement in Britain, but there was the more famous one, obviously, is in America. So I think, one, that's a really important difference in terms of who the Black people that are here are, in terms of, how they came to be here. And then, on top of that is the nature of the police. It was really shocking in the last week seeing a lot of protesters in Britain, having their hands up, saying, hands up, don't shoot.
I mean, it's a very serious subject, but that is laughable. Yeah. There's no other way to really talk about that particular thing without pointing out the fact that UK police don't carry guns and couldn't shoot people if they wanted to.
No, exactly. So I think that is, in and of itself, a really fundamental difference in terms of the nature of policing. Obviously British police are, police by consent and are disarmed. That's very different to the kind of really hyper-militarized police that we have in America that actually affects all different races in quite significant ways. And on top of that, in terms of the perception of interracial relationships and kind of, the relationship between the multi-ethnic working class in Britain, again, is really different. So anti-racist struggles in Britain have often been, the white working class as well has been very much at the forefront. And there's a lot of class solidarity between the kind of diversity of the working class in Britain, in contrast to America, which is not, there isn't enough, or there isn't as much stronger sense of class solidarity amongst the working class in general. And on top of that, for example, Black men in London, are far higher to actually, far higher percentage actually marry white women. So there's actually a lot of interracial relationships. That's, a positive thing that happens in Britain. And that's, again, in contrast to America, which has a more kind of tumultuous relationship with interracial relationships and that kind of cross-cultural integration. So I think these are really, really important differences which shape race relations in Britain very differently to the one in America.
Okay, so it might be worth talking a little bit about Black Lives Matter as a movement, because it's difficult to approach this topic in the sense that many people look at it on face value, many well-meaning people, no doubt, and assume that because they're called Black Lives Matter, their raison d'etre is simply to oppose racial injustice, which is a cause that I would be on board with, everyone I know would be on board with. However, once you scratch the surface of BLM, a lot of their claims are dubious at best. They have some overtly peculiar things on their manifesto that are, kind of far left anti-capitalist goals, things about abolishing the police that most people probably wouldn't be on board with if they knew that's what BLM were after. So maybe you could speak a little bit about what the organisation represents to you. What do BLM stand for, do you think?
Yeah, so as you just outlined, I think it is a really important distinction in terms of Black Lives Matter as an organisation, and generally people that have sympathies with the kind of claims of a society of racial injustice. In terms of Black Lives Matter as an organisation, as you've already described, actually, if we interrogate many of the claims that are being made, they have a particular kind of radical left, anti-capitalist, what they call, white supremacist patriarchy, and they advocate for specific things that will forward what they believe to be, overthrowing capitalism. And I think that what's really interesting, if we look at the history of Black Lives Matter, it started in response to the kind of Ferguson riots in particular. That's when it got notoriety under Obama. And we've seen over 5 years since that particular moment. And in terms of what they have specifically achieved during this time, very few people can actually tell me what those things are. And they have, if you look at their finances, have received millions and millions and millions of dollars. But in terms of specific material changes that they have actually advocated for, is actually very, very slim. And I think that it is really worrying, because I think it's a really great tactic for them to use the phrase Black Lives Matter, because not many people would obviously disagree with that. But the narrative that they're actually putting forward, for me, is actually a deeply fact-free and debilitating one. This narrative of a kind of global mythology about what it means to be Black, and that one is, in their view, essentialized to be one of racism, oppression, and victimhood. And I think that message is really damaging, not only because it doesn't necessarily stack up specifically to the facts of the matter, but I also think it is sending a deeply disempowering message to a young generation of Black people, including myself, that haven't in some ways had it so good in terms of race relations. We've made leaps and bounds in this country in terms of grassroots campaign, legislative change, programs, schemes in order to increase representation and accessibility. And the society, I would say, on the whole, is a really open and welcoming society. So instead of acknowledging that change and that progress we've had, I would argue that an entire infrastructure in many ways has been created in order to perpetuate a particular narrative of a kind of Black victimhood narrative and a white privilege narrative. And I think that so far I've not seen a single specific policy or program that has come out of any of these movements that will actually improve the material life of anybody, for that matter, not just Black people.
Yeah, that's a great point. So obviously Black Lives Matter have the attention of the world. They've got the monetary support, as you just outlined. But I suppose maybe just to query that a bit deeper in terms of them not putting their efforts and funds into things that would improve the material lives of Black people. What areas could you look in and contribute to and support in order to sincerely and legitimately help Black people in the UK or the US prosper more than they are?
So, personally, I actually think that the biggest issue facing Black people in Britain, I would say specifically, is not an issue of race. And I think the danger is, in many ways, these blunt instruments of kind of a race-based policy that don't actually get to the heart of the issue. My personal opinion, and obviously some people dispute that, is I think that the biggest issue in terms of perpetual systems of inequality is actually one of class. And so when we look at immigrant populations in Britain, for example, naturally, as they are often coming to Britain to have a better life, they end up moving into poor areas and, are experiencing impoverishment. And in many of those poor areas, obviously, there's, lower educational attainment and crime and kind of young people getting exposed to abuse. And I find that when we look at the statistics, a lot of the issues that are actually affecting Black people and actually just immigrant communities more broadly are actual issues to do with class. And I would really like to see a kind of analysis of class when it comes to these issues. And I'll give a specific example. What I find really fascinating is the huge disparities amongst BME groups themselves. So, for example, British Indians are actually one of the most successful immigrant descended groups in Britain. British Nigerian children, for example, have a higher educational attainment rate to the white British population and Britain more broadly. So if we're looking at things like educational attainment, life outcomes, there are huge disparities amongst races in Britain and within ethnic groups, within the kind of Black and ethnic minority. So we cannot solely put it down to race. I think that class has a really big part to play in it. I also think culture, in terms of Indian communities, as well as particularly my own heritage, like Nigerians, have a much kind of more forthright attitude when it comes to expectations and education. So that often helps them to move up the social ladder in terms of social mobility. And so there are a huge range of factors at play. And so what I'm really, really resistant to this kind of one size fits all argument of systemic racism, which doesn't actually get to the heart of the different issues at play. And one more thing I wanted to say about that. The truth of the matter is, white working class boys in this country are actually one of the most disadvantaged groups. And so the idea that the biggest issue facing inequality in Britain is one of race just does not stack up to the reality of what the actual information and data shows.
Yeah, I mean, so just to keep on the issue of information and data, obviously we can have access, we can get access to these things fairly easily now, and they actually paint a more a vastly different picture than the one we are getting in our headlines day after day. And they always, I've noticed now, whenever somebody's shot by the police or dies in police custody, if they're black, that's in the headline immediately, and there's very little further investigation there by the general public. It's just a point of outrage to run with again. And I just wanted to get your opinion and feeling on our news media in this regard. I personally feel like they're failing in their duty not to highlight a lot of these facts and a lot of the data you've just run through there. I mean, is there an agenda, or is it a case of them being unaware? Why are they not running with this in a more data-driven, fact-based approach?
Yes, I think that's a really good question. So what I actually do find is that a lot of the statistics that I actually use to support my argument are ones that I have actually found on the mainstream media. So, for example, one that I found on the BBC, one of the narratives that are being perpetuated in regards to Black Lives Matter in the UK is this idea that there is an epidemic of essentially black men dying in police custody. What the data that actually found from the BBC was, over the past 10 years, 163 people have died in or following police custody in England and Wales. Of that 163, 13 were black, and that's in 10 years. So that's about one person a year. And in fact, over the past 10 years, a white individual who had been arrested was about 25% more likely to die in police custody than a black individual who had been arrested. That's actually from the BBC.
Yeah.
So what I'm actually finding is that they actually do report the statistics, but when it comes to the kind of overarching narrative, that is not being told. And I don't know all of the reasons for that. I think part of it is this really kind of hyper sensationalized climate. We saw it with the lockdown and COVID, how we were all being told, obviously, that, if we left the house, we would be akin to kind of killing our grandmother. But then almost instantly, it's been completely excusable to gathering crowds of, tens of thousands of people, as long as it is right on opinions. So I think that there is a lot of hypocrisy going on. I don't think we have a kind of media climate that is following kind of journalistic integrity. But I also think part of it is to do with, a lot of the time it gives a lot of people, particularly in the elite, particularly in the establishment, a sense of moral superiority to kind of frame society in this way and frame themselves as part of the solution, and kind of, being part of the change, when in reality they're actually perpetuating a narrative that is quite debilitating for people. So I think that there's so many reasons why it's happening, but I think it's really destructive.
So a lot of the time I'll note that the word systemic is used in this area of discourse to, systemic racism, and I find that very hard to nail down a definition, really, and obviously sometimes feels like it's almost an unfalsifiable position people throw out on purpose. And I just wanted to get your view on this idea that the police are systemically racist in the UK. We live in a sort of white supremacist society where black people or non-white people should feel like their life is in danger when they leave the house. I think I heard somebody say publicly, it might have even been a politician, that being black in the UK is almost like a death sentence in 2020. Now, I just want to, that seems so far removed from reality to me, but then again, I have my white privilege to shield me from these things, or so they say. So how do you feel about this idea of systemic racism and living in a white supremacist society?
Yeah, there's multiple things that I would say. I think that I reject the idea personally. I reject the idea that Britain is systemically racist, that we're living in a white supremacist society. I think that if at the very least, if I was to concede anything, we live in a white majority society that, has a history of being predominantly of, white British people. And so I think the culture and values emanate from that dominant population. I don't think that is necessarily that they are, supremacist, or that that means that Britain is inherently discriminatory. But I think just by virtue of living in a white majority country, that means that the kind of values and norms emanate from that particular majority. Again, I think in regards to, a lot of the narratives, as I said, that we are, it's dangerous to be black in Britain or in the world. Again, it is really, really, doesn't stack up to reality. And the only places that it does actually stack up, which I find, unfortunate but ironic in many ways, are the places that we are not even talking about. The fact that, that there is still kind of slavery that actually persists in many parts of the Middle East. Many of the places that is actually worse to be black, unfortunately, are actually some countries within black majority countries. And so I think that when it comes to being a black person, I would definitely say that Britain and many countries in the West is actually the best in terms of when it comes to opportunities, freedom, democracy, and an opportunity to affect change. I mean, we have a cabinet in this country. Two of the most powerful positions in this country are held by one, a woman of Asian heritage, Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who controls the finances of this country, Rishi Sunak. And so it doesn't speak to my experience. And I think that's why we then see something called standpoint epistemology. And this is a kind of what I would say a pseudo-intellectual philosophical concept that came out of academia, got a lot of influences of postmodernism and this, that, and the other, is this idea that you or me as a black woman have a one perspective that nobody can have access to. And so that's why you hear these things about you as a white person can't understand me, or this is my lived experience. And people use this language to kind of curl their way out of actually being able to account for the statements that they're making. They're saying that, oh, well, it's just my view, it's just my perspective, it's just my experience. Well, if you're using your experience to kind of make a claim about society at large, then you have to be able to justify that and for people to interrogate that. And so this is what we have. We have, on the one hand, being told that, white people need to educate themselves and understand their privilege and all of this, that, the other. But on the other hand, people are saying, well, you'll never understand you as a white person. So we have a situation where we're getting into a situation where not only do white people, unfortunately, feel, many have come to me saying that they don't know what to do, what can they do, how do they help? But on the other hand, having a situation where we can't properly communicate because we're being told that our different group identities mean that it will never be an honest, legitimate, and kind of fair conversation. And again, so that's why I'm not surprised by what we're seeing, the breakdown of public debate, the destruction of statues, the kind of violence and all of these things going on, because it's part of a particular worldview which is underpinned by this kind of, refusal to engage in dialogue and free speech, to actually come to some kind of constructive and positive vision for the future.
Yeah, I mean, the debate feels like it's been significantly dumbed down, and I saw people who should know better really making the point that you are either for the destruction of certain statues or you're for slavery, and there's no middle ground on that. And I kind of feel like the issue of slavery in the UK has been put to bed, but I mean, it might be interesting even to circle back on something you mentioned near the start of the podcast about this expectation of black people to be one political mind, sort of homogenous group with the same worldviews and politics, and we seem to be moving away from the idea of the individual in that regard. And a running theme that I've noticed when talking to people on my show who are not white but deviate from expected narratives is the level of actual racial abuse they receive from people who would describe themselves as anti-racists as well. And I don't know how you feel about that, or what experience you've had of that. And I suppose some cynics looking into a conversation like this may dismiss you as somebody who's being used by somebody with white privilege to parrot their status quo views on race and the society in general. And I was wondering how much of that comes back to you and in what form.
Yeah, so the first thing I'll say is that, it is unfortunate, but that is a reality. A lot of ethnic minorities that feel patriotic, that feel overall happy about Britain, that feel like they belong and feel comfortable in their own skin, and I think that's a really, important point, are claim to be perpetuating a system of disadvantage. But what I find is that the people that I have come across, many of them, and a growing number of ethnic minority people that challenge this narrative, I find oftentimes they're the people that have often come to terms with, history the most, that would like to move on, that would like to, have a more positive, inclusive vision of Britain, that would actually like to deal with these issues deeply. And what I do find, and I think, it's unfortunate to say, is that one of the claims about, racism externally, for me, I think the issue is often racism internally. I think I find a lot of internalized racism that go on when you see non-white people attacking other non-white people for deviating from a specific narrative. Now, if we if we want to kind of combat racism and overcome it, then presumably I would think we would want ethnic minority people to have the broad diversity of opinion that exists amongst white people, as individuals who have different unique experiences, beliefs and understandings and opinions about the world. To see a diverse range of opinions, I would see that as a kind of a progress, that we are not only now defined by a racial politics, but again this type of thinking does threaten the status quo. And I actually think that this is an important point, because I think a lot of what we're told is that what is happening now, Black Lives Matter and all of these things, are actually challenging the status quo. I would argue to the contrary. I actually think that in some ways they are the establishment reinventing themselves, because we've seen this movement endorsed by corporations, the royal family, many people that could not be more privileged, could not be the bigger beneficiaries of the status quo. They would not endorse this movement if they thought it meant any challenge at all to the kind of existing power structures that happen. And it benefits the existing power structures for people that otherwise, which would be on the same fight, that would be kind of brothers and sisters and in unity, to instead be fighting amongst ourselves. So I actually think there is nothing radical about Black Lives Matter and the movement itself. I think it's actually really helpful to the status quo, because we are not focusing right now on the fact that the economy has shrunk by 20%, or stagnant wages have stagnated, that income inequality is increasing. These are things that are affecting all races. I think we are focusing on race when it's actually not the biggest issue, in my opinion, affecting Black people or people in general in this country. So yeah, it is unfortunate that there is a lot of racism and attacks that happen to people that challenge this narrative. But I think, when you believe, I'd rather say what I believe to be true than kind of not say what I believe to be true and watch society go downhill.
Yeah, that's very eloquently put. So I suppose then, what explains this phenomena in terms of the amount of people gathering in support of this cause, the amount of corporations hitching their wagon to it? You couldn't open anything without some sort of endorsement of BLM in the last few weeks. I'm glad that PG Tips has set me straight on racism. I may have gone out and done a racism were it not for brand awareness. But so obviously it gives you the individuals looking from the outside in who don't agree with this. It gives you this feeling of the only sane person in the asylum. And as we've spoke about moments ago, it takes a quick Google search to see that a lot of the claims that this movement's built on are not cannot survive the merest of scrutiny. So how do you explain this huge crowd and corporate response? What's the psychology here where people have bought into it completely without question?
Yeah, I think that there are multiple different forces, as you will, at play. So I think on one hand, I do actually think some of it is genuinely the lockdown. I think a lot of people have been kind of suffocated inside for the past 3 months. And in some ways, it was just kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, which has just kind of unleashed this outpouring of energy and emotion, and people don't really want to go back inside. They want to kind of be part of something bigger that kind of forces us outside and forces us to kind of talk about something else. So that's on the kind of immediate standpoint, obviously. But I also think from a kind of societal point, I think it's something that's been building for quite a number of decades now. Other people have talked about this whole, what I would consider in some ways a kind of infection of this post-modernist, post-structuralist ideology and kind of critical race theory, which has become very embedded in our institutions. And I think a lot of people previously thought, it was just like a fringe group of academics and students, but this has grown and naturally students graduate. So this has become now part of the kind of media and the kind of technological establishment. And a lot of critical race theory, for example, views every interaction, all aspects of our history, culture, as implicitly or explicitly racist. That is very much part of, and so they never believe that we can even ever escape that, because it's so embedded and entrenched in all of our kind of being and existence. And so this particular worldview, forms very much the basis of many of the kind of ideologies, this kind of woke identitarianism that we are seeing now, and it's now become, very much a part of academia, very much a part of social life. So I think that we've got the kind of immediate reasons why this has emerged, but the kind of broader reasons in terms of the ideological shifts that have happened over the last couple of decades. And then, as we also mentioned, you've got the media and this kind of feeding off the sensationalism. And then we've got social media. Yeah. I think that the nature of social media now, with the echo chambers and the kind of ways in which information travels so quickly and broadly, it gives people this sense of like fulfillment and instant gratification to kind of be part of something, regardless of what it means. And I think another thing is a huge collapse of adult authority. I've written about this whole notion of the cult of youth. We saw it with kind of Greta Thunberg, this idea that because something young people believe, generally means that it is right and good for society. And we don't see a lot of adults standing up and challenging it. And we saw that with the whole debate about gender. So I think a lot of these things are a continuation and an amplification of a lot of wider trends that we're seeing in society to do with censorship, kind of a very one-dimensional blanket narrative of politics, and a kind of inability to be able to engage in constructive discourse. So I think this particular instance seems to be a kind of culmination of a lot of forces that have been operating and building up and coming to a head in this kind of cataclysm of kind of a fact-free uproar of anger and frustration that is quite, not directed and quite nihilistic.
I mean, how have we got into a situation where we have Donald Trump in the White House, we have a Conservative government, vote Leave won in the Brexit referendum, yet the sort of critical race theory proponents, the far left intersectionalists, seem to dominate the culture, from media to institutions, academia, social network. So how have we got this disparity where it seems on the face of it that the general public does not care for identity politics in this way? However, people who are so invested in identity politics seem to control the narrative.
Yeah, so I think there was a statement that Andrew Breitbart made before he died when he said, politics is downstream from culture. So I do agree with that, and I think it's also very much in line with the kind of postmodern worldview that if you control the discourses or the way in which people speak about things and understand things, then you essentially become you essentially control the thing itself. And so I think that the right in some ways won the kind of economic and political game, but the left, particularly the radical new far left, won the cultural game. And I think that even if the right might have the levers of power in terms of what ultimately gets to shape our understanding of self and our understanding of society and culture and each other, is our culture. And so I think that even though the silent majority, obviously politically, they have won, in terms of the kind of time in between that, between the elections, we are seeing this kind of huge battle play out. And so I think that, I think that the left did win the kind of culture war quite a long time ago, and they've kind of continued to grow and expand in their influence since then. And one of the I think it is different in America with Trump, but in Britain, I don't think that we have a lot of kind of strong political leadership. I think we have, unfortunately, a lot of kind of political cowardice and a lot of pandering to this. So an example would be the Gender Recognition Act. Now, whatever anyone's opinions of it are, in terms of what we might understand to be a kind of traditional conservative thing, the idea that people can self-identify as a particular gender is not actually, the conservative government were the one that actually proposed this change in law. And so even though we might have a conservative government, they're not what they're actually conserving, traditions, the family, the institutions, that's not actually clear. So I think that the fact that the left have actually still have a monopoly on cultural production is actually still influencing the way that our politics is done, even if we have even if we have maybe the quote unquote traditional right or the kind of centre right in the levers of power.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me. What I worry about going forward is the fact that it seems to me that even if we have good police in America who aren't racist, we're still going to get a video footage year on year of unarmed black men being shot by the police, either in some instances unjust, in some instances you could argue it's just. And my worry is that this is going to repeat and repeat and repeat over and over again. And as we saw this weekend, we had a counter protest, and there appeared to be some far right extremist elements there. And I just want to ask whether or not it's possible that the narrative of this overtly racist system that sees black people as a fair game for execution, essentially, may bring about real dark elements from the far right to actually challenge it. And we may end up in a situation where we are seeing a sort of, I don't want to use the word race war, but real civil unrest and a breakdown of race relations purely based on a false narrative.
Yeah, this is a genuinely real possibility, and in some ways that's why I have chosen to involve myself in the argument, because as I said, this isn't actually the traditional thing that I've been speaking about, but I've actually worried that this movement has the potential to genuinely make my life in Britain much worse, because they're perpetuating a narrative that will build resentment and kind of anger, and a lot of people, particularly on the fringe far right, will then exploit that in order to push forward their own, equally toxic agenda. And I think what's really interesting is that many of the ideas that come out of this woke identitarianism have really strong overlaps with the far right. And this is why it's really important to, that we really interrogate the ideology behind it, because there's huge overlaps. This idea that certain races are kind of inherently privileged and inherently victimized and oppressed is not far off to the kind of white supremacist notion that certain races are inherently superior and others are inherently inferior. This idea that by virtue of your pigmentation you are destined to be a certain way, or a very racially fatalistic view, they have really strong overlaps with each other. This idea that we need to think about whiteness, and white people now need to band together and think about themselves, and so do black people. That's very, again, huge overlaps with far-right white supremacist ideology. And so they've now in some ways become a symbiotic relationship with one another. Both of them are trying to ignite tensions, trying to ignite a race war in some ways, and trying to justify their own existence. The far right want to say, look what is happening to our country. We're being, destroyed or taken over in our own country. And this woke far left want to go, look, the far right are on the rise. That means that Britain is a racist country. And so it is genuinely worrying that this, unless we want to see our society go backwards in a huge way, more people really have to stand up. And I know that it's hard, in this whole idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, one of the main human need is a sense of belonging and acceptance. And, it is difficult sometimes when you're going to be vilified to kind of say, actually, what about this? What about, this information? But to me, the alternative is genuinely worse. And I think the more of us that say no to this toxic and pernicious view, and start actually articulating that this is a really positive thing that I'd like to see, not only a criticism of kind of Black Lives Matter and kind of woke politics, but actually re-articulating a positive kind of humanistic, universalist vision of Britain, one that sees Britain as a multi-ethnic society where we can collectively work together in order to make it better, is what we really need to see. And I think people are really crying out for that positive, uplifting vision after just seeing so much negativity, so much narratives of victimhood and oppression. And there are many, many, many ethnic minorities that support this kind of more positive vision.
Yeah, I mean, it's my personal hope that obviously it'll hit a peak at some point, and then the people will feel enough is enough and start being more vocal. But I'm really glad that you feel that you can speak up in an area that must be very difficult to say what you think. I mean, I've noticed as well over the last few days, and it's irritating, but it feels like a minor point, or maybe you feel differently, but people are now trying to find any sort of racial content or sort of sin committed in sitcoms or various other TV shows, and we've seen some of the big streaming sites capitulate to this quote-unquote concern. I think Netflix has pulled certain episodes of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. We've seen Little Britain have this light shone on it for this. I think I saw Faulty Towers perhaps as well. And a lot of it revolves around this idea of blackface or stereotypes. And I mean, to me, it feels like, in a sense, real dangerous racist targets are so difficult to find that we have to go back into the archives, in a sense. But I don't know how you feel about this idea of retroactively cancelling things for not chiming with the zeitgeist of today.
Yeah, I really agree with you. I think in some ways it is kind of ironic that people are somehow struggling to find actual specific things in the present day. And I think that tells us a lot about the nature of racism in Britain, that people are spending almost all their energy, sanitizing the past and trying to find something in the past, because what the situation right now is not as clear-cut and simple as they'd really like to make it out to be. I am a free speech advocate. I oppose censorship. I think I don't agree with retrospectively, punishing the past for the way in which our moralities have now changed in the present day. I think that many of these comedy sketches and history books and statues tell us who we are. We as human beings are both beautiful and ambitious and innovative, but there are dark elements. There are things that we've done that we might regard as morally reprehensible, but also we might have done things just as in comedy sketches that we may now just don't really think is that funny. That's interesting. That's okay. And that's why I do worry. I don't think that it's going to just fizzle out. It may calm down a bit, but I think that, as I said, with this whole notion of critical race theory and the ideologies that underpin it, it is a kind of all-encompassing movement that seeks to kind of reshape all aspects of social life in its own image. So it can only really be kind of nipped in the bud when we do have some strong political authority, stand up and say no, and have the people behind that authority, wanting to instill confidence and kind of praise and champion Britain as a nation again, because it will only keep going worse. I've had interviews with people saying that they don't even want their lecturers to read words of Black authors themselves that might have actually used the N-word. And so the idea that it would just kind of is based on anything other than irrationality is self-evidently not the case.
What was your reaction these last few weeks in seeing prominent Labour politicians and members of the police and celebrities and lovely quaint villages in Oxford take the knee in the name of BLM?
I think it's a really pertinent example of the nature of our politics. Superficial, meaningless gestures that are much more about the kind of self-importance of the individual doing it and the kind of self-aggrandizement than doing anything that actually meaningfully addresses any of the things that are being claimed to be the things that these protesters care about. I oppose this kind of politics, this kind of self-flagellation, white guilt, victimhood politics. I think it's demoralizing. I think it's disempowering. And I think that, as I said, I think it only stokes up some very dark forces within society. I want to see a positive vision. This is lazy. This is easy. It does nothing to actually help people in the present day. It's very much in line with this very narcissistic kind of me culture that thinks, instant gratification, instant kind of social validation is much more important than the long, hard, and often arduous work of building a coherent political program.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. And there does seem to be a focus in activism now on victimhood instead of empowerment. We used to see a lot of civil rights movements and a lot of genuine causes would make significant gains in the name of empowerment, and now it seems more about who can claim the most victimhood points. And so what's the mentality there now, where it's not a case of we need to empower women as much as possible, which feminism used to do. It's now a case of you're a woman, you live under a patriarchy, it's a man's world, you're never going to attain the same status and lifestyle, and same with ethnic minorities as well. You live in a white supremacist society, you're always going to have the boot on your head, you'll never be equal. So what's the change in mentality there in terms of activism?
Yeah, as I said earlier, I do think that particularly since we made many of these civil rights gains, even as early as gay marriage, a kind of entire infrastructure was left that was about kind of social justice and kind of civil rights and kind of changing society in this particular way, but there wasn't necessarily the gains. Most of the gains had actually already been won, and I think there's an inability to accept that we have, we still have work to do, don't get me wrong, but we have genuinely made a success. And then on top of that, I think a lot of it is about power. I think that we are seeing people, say things like, oh, well, make space for Black people, make space for women. That's not my goal of a fair society. I don't want to attain positions by virtue of my race alone, or by someone just, giving me that position because I am a Black woman. I think that is completely ridiculous and patronizing. The goal of a meritocracy, we don't even hear that word very much anymore. This idea that people should get to positions by virtue of their skills and abilities is just a goal that's being lost. The goal that, of colorblindness, the goal that no one should be defined by these immutable characteristics is being lost. I think it makes people feel good to kind of wallow in this mentality and not to take leverage their agency and personal responsibility. But on top of that, what is fascinating is whilst all of this is happening, we are in a society that is we saw the launch of that rocket by Elon Musk. We're seeing huge transformations in technology and innovation, and the rise of China and what that means internationally. These are huge, massive questions that have the potential to fundamentally reimagine what it means to be human in the world. And we are stuck in this kind of rut of talking about race and gender and things that actually no longer mean the things or define people's potential in the way that they did before. And so I think it's really unfortunate, and I think the psychology behind it is a lot of narcissism and kind of just wallowing. And I want to see, as I said, a much more positive, empowering, and future-facing type of politics again.
Are you trying to say that a bunch of celebrities very solemnly staring into the camera in black and white isn't going to cure racism? Well, maybe I've got time to ask you about one last thing, because I think, like you, I have a huge passion for freedom of expression. Everything I'm interested in seems to stem from that one principle. I'm very protective of it. I'm very sensitive to any attacks on it, probably oversensitive, but I think that's the way you have to be with freedom of expression to an extent. And you're the director of the Free Speech Union. And what can you tell me about that organisation, in firstly in terms of goals, and secondly, what areas in UK life do you think are especially a threat to our freedom of expression?
Yeah, so, what's really interesting is that we do actually have various kind of civil liberties, infrastructure in the country. But there's been one particular area which a lot of organisations, unfortunately, hadn't really been as forthright as perhaps they could have done. And this is this idea that people are being, kicked out of their job and, deplatformed just for simple statements that they're made, or by pressure from a kind of particular section of the kind of, again, woke radical side. And so what the Free Speech Union does, we've hoped to kind of fill this vacuum. And so we defend people, our members that are facing curbs on their free speech rights. So this can, manifest itself in a range of ways. We helped Amber Rudd, who was being deplatformed from Oxford University, another feminist lecturer, Selena Todd. So we kind of write letters and put pressure on these organizations. We help people find representation if they're facing disciplinary procedures at work. We even, might crowdfund and provide legal support. And what has been shocking is the amount of cases we've received. And that says that, there are so many people that are being removed and deplatformed and silenced for things that they've said. So that the kind of landscape for free speech right now, is actually really, really scary. As I said, a lot of people think it's just this fringe kind of campus free speech wars, but now it has permeated into so many of our institutions that think simple things like, for example, a radio presenter in the last week is being investigated for criticizing Black Lives Matter. Yeah, so we are facing, quite an all-encompassing and suffocating climate for free speech, and the Free Speech Union is hoping and is so far being an addition to really pushing back against that very restricted climate.
Okay, I mean that's something I've kind of looked at, but not looked at into an extensive amount of detail. So I'll definitely revisit that because it sounds really interesting. It sounds like an issue very close to my heart as well. So I'll make sure I include links. I mean, where can people find more information on the Free Speech Union?
Yep, it's literally just freespeechunion.org, and it says all of the people that are involved in the organisation, how you can be part of it, what we do. It's all freespeechunion.org.
Brilliant. Well, Inaya, we pretty much ran through everything I wanted to talk about. You've been very detailed and articulate, and you speak a lot of sense. I'm always very pleased to see you pop up on our news media. Is there anything else you'd like to get across at all before I let you get back to your evening?
I would just say, I don't want people to despair and to lose hope. I've got a lot of emails recently from people just saying, they don't know what to do and they're really down and despairing about what's happening to the country. But I do think, it is small, it is a minority right now, but a growing number of people are really speaking out. I'm hoping, I'm trying to be one of those people that are pushing back against this. And I do think that if we hold the line, we will, change society in a positive direction again.
Brilliant. Yeah, I admire your positivity on this one. It's it's refreshing to hear on this topic. So yeah, once again, thanks for being a voice of reason, and I really enjoyed the chat.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Godless Spellchecker podcast. The podcast is a one-man operation, produced in my spare time away from my day job, and I love making it for you. If you enjoy what you hear, please consider lending some support. The show is entirely listener supported. I don't sell anything, I don't run ads, and given the alternative and unpopular focus of my content, it's very unlikely to find a sponsor. So there are a number of ways you can support and chip in and help improve the show and give me more time to produce more content. You can become a patron supporter and pledge a monetary amount per month or per episode by visiting patreon.com/gspellchecker. If you can't lend monetary support right now, don't worry, there's other ways you can help the podcast too. You can share it on your various social media networks, or take a moment to leave a review wherever you listen to it. Your support is massively appreciated. Thank you. Think we've all learned something here today?